name is Abubakar Hara. I'm a lecturer in International Relations Department, University of Jember. So after the introduction, I will talk about common framework for peace in ASEAN. Then I will discuss the transformation of ASEAN framework for peace from negative to positive peace. After that, I will talk about ASEAN ways and roles of individual states in conflict resolutions. Then we will discuss beyond ASEAN way. So over there, we'll talk about ASEAN Charter, ICHAR, ASEAN IPR, and AHA. Lastly, I will talk about conclusion and way forward. I'll start with the introduction. Generally, I would like to talk about the transformation of ASEAN in looking at the peace or in defining peace. So previously, we understand that the definition or concept of peace in ASEAN is based on negative peace, and later on it changed to what we call positive peace. What we mean by negative peace is a peace mainly based on focus on state. So when we have a good relation between states, there is no wars, there's no tensions, there is a kind of peaceful coexistence between states, then we have peace. So this is the peace in a very narrow sense, in very narrow meanings, and it happened in ASEAN actually for quite a long time. There is no war, big war among states in this region, although countries here has very different political system. They are not implementing democracy, for example, but there's no war between states, ASEAN states so far. But this definition of state is called this definition of peace, I mean, is based on a definition of negative peace. Then so we have a transformation of this meaning from negative to positive peace. What we mean by positive peace is an attitude, institution, and activities to support the peace process in a very broader sense. So this is not only peace between states and or no war situation, but peace is defined not only state security but also human security issues. So there are a lot of issues that have to be faced, have to be overcome in this new definition of peace. And also, initially, we have the so called state centered ASEAN, then now we have people centered ASEAN. So, this is the main themes that I'm going to discuss regarding ASEAN conception or framework for peace. I move to the next part of the presentation. So, I want to talk a little bit about the early formation of ASEAN. So ASEAN, as everybody knows, it was established in 1967 in Bangkok, and during that time, there was a tension among states in these regions. There was communist threat, the Cold War was still there between the United States and Soviet Union. So the organization was established, but its work very slow actually. Um, but only later on, in 1971, they agreed to have a ZOPAN, Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, and then later on it was developed into Southeast Asia nuclear weapon free zones in 1995. So this is an agreement to avoid external interference in Southeast Asia problem, in ASEAN problems. In 1976, so this is the crucial time for ASEAN when they signed the so-called Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. So this become a basis, actually, a kind of charter, although it is not an official charter, but this is a kind of agreements about the fundamental of the organization. So in the treaty, we have this principle: respect for independence, free from external interference, and non-interference principles in international affairs of other states, settlement of differences, disputes by peaceful means, renunciation of threat or use of force, and effective cooperation among states in the region. So this is a very basic agreements agreed by 5 members of ASEAN at the times, because have not the membership was not enlarged into to include this Indochina states. And there are at least 3 common perspectives to understand ASEAN since the early establishment of the organization. And so far, we have ASEAN Way principle. So this is the way that how ASEAN solve conflicts and differences among themselves. So they establish a kind of norms which is called ASEAN Way. So this is kind of ethic. Actually, this ethic is based on the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. This principle and the treaty have been socialized among countries in the region. So the main principles in ASEAN Way is principle of non-interference, respect for territorial integrity, peaceful conflict resolution, dialogue, consensus. For examples, ASEAN have to make a decision based on consensus. So far, this is the way how ASEAN deal and solve the differences if they have problem among states in the region. As I mentioned earlier, there's a transformation from the negative peace to positive peace. So if they want to have a positive peace, then they need a kind of changings in non-intervention principle. They have to modify the intervention principle. So they need to do this because there has been a changing environment in these regions. People demand ASEAN to be useful for the people. So they want ASEAN to address human security issues, for example. It is not enough to have no war situation. So we need to deal issues like migration, women's human rights, haze problems. All of these things has to be dealt by ASEAN if uh, the organization want to function better. So to respond to this situation, then ASEAN made several sub-organizations, as I will explain here. There are several sub organizations that I want to focus on. The first is Human Rights Commission, and then ASEAN IPR, and then AHA, ASEAN Center for Humanitarian Assistance. But before that, we ASEAN have ASEAN Charter. This is a kind of breakthrough in ASEAN because after 40 years, ASEAN was able to agree on a kind of charter. So the charter are mainly based on the treaty principle, treaty of amity and cooperation, based on the principle and norms of cooperation, norm of cooperation that have been running so far. And the charter was formalized in Singapore in 20 November 2007 by 10 head of the ASEAN state. And then another sub-organization that has been established to support the so-called positive peace in Southeast Asia is ICHR or ICHR, ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and it was inaugurated at the 15th ASEAN Summit in Hua Hin, Thailand. There has been a lot of human rights violation in ASEAN, of course, and they feel that they need to address this, but it is a very difficult actually to have an agreement to have this body, and when finally they agree, to establish this body, the power of the body was very weak actually. And in the term of reference of ICHR, this organization was only able to promote human rights, so they have no power to implement or to enforce human rights in the region. So what the organization was able to do is to promote introducing human rights to people in ASEAN. Other sub-organization that I want to talk is AEPR, the ASEAN Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. It was established on May 8, 2011 at the ASEAN Summit in Jakarta. So this is a mechanism to resolve conflicts through dialogue. And ASEAN previously does not have an institution that can identify conflict in the regions. So the several conflict is a kind of time bomb. So the ASEAN need a kind of institution to monitor, to identify, to discuss these potential conflict, potential issues. And another organization is AHA Center. This is ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance, and established in 17 November 2011. So this is to coordinate humanitarian assistance for natural disaster. Previously, assistance was very sporadic, not directed and not coordinated. But with this organization, then effort to help victims of disaster can be more productive, more focused, because they have this coordinating body. So this is the way of how a center works. There are several steps that they have to do before they are able uh, to take actions in the area need help. And another aspect that support the positive peace in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, I mean, is the role of role of non-state actors such as NGO. And in 2000s, for example, there was ASEAN People Assembly. This is uh, various NGO and think tanks. They met ASEAN People Assembly, and they had a meeting in Batam in 2000s in conjunction with the fourth ASEAN Summit, and they proposed a lot of issues, a lot of ideas at the time, and it was attended by 30 NGO representatives. But then it was continued by another organizations, so-called ASEAN People Forum. This is to continue the role of IPA. Then API has continued to meet before ASEAN Summit since its formation in 2005 until now. So this is the role of NGO. So as a conclusion, we can see that ASEAN perspective on peace has changed from negative peace to positive peace. ASEAN must change because of the community and spotlight from international community. So people need a more functional ASEAN. People centered is needed. Is no longer state centered. So they need to manage human rights, peace, and conflict issues in a more positive way. And because of that, ASEAN had have several sub-organizations, as I mentioned earlier. So then this means ASEAN need to involve more non-state actors, and also they need to compromise the principle, the non-intervention principle. So that's all my presentation.